All right, good afternoon. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me. I was just having a little Zoom issues where it was kind of booting me out of the session. So hopefully you guys can see or hear me. I went ahead and opened up chat and the Q&A just in case you can't. So please let me know if you're having any issues. Otherwise, again, appreciate you joining this month, and we'll go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk about preparing for an audit. Fairly easy topic to cover, not a very lengthy slide deck, but one of the reasons I think this is important is there's a lot of folks who have never been through an audit, or they've been through an audit under one framework and they're getting ready to go into something else. You don't know if it's going to be similar, the same, completely different. So I'm going to try to touch on those things that are kind of similar and things that you should be thinking about preparing for regardless of what the framework is. And I'll stay out of sort of the niche areas where it's framework specific. Like I said, cover a small number of slides. We're going to talk about your initial steps, the preparation for the audit, the process of being audited, and then the post-audit steps, and then opened up as usual to a Q&A. So these 6 steps aren't necessarily in any particular order, although I did put them in an order because I think logically you need to follow some type of framework, and certain things are going to get a little bit hazy for you and messed up if you take them out of order. Depending on who you are in the organization, what your role will be in finding an auditor or managing the audit, some of these things may get shifted around. But I've heard a lot of times someone coming and saying, we need an audit, how much will it cost? And initially, cost just becomes the first step. If you do that, you're going to find yourself running into problems, and you're probably not going to choose the right audit firm. So whenever possible, try to at least follow kind of this basic framework. Start with determining which audit is best for your organization. And that might sound obvious, except for some organizations, there's a requirement. So for example, if you're a defense contractor, maybe CMMC is a requirement under one of your contracts. That's pretty simple. Then I'm going out and getting a CMMC audit. But for others, it's more about marketing, cyber insurance, what your clients might want. And if you have a diverse client portfolio, you may not know which one is best. To give you an example, you'll hear a lot of folks go out and get an audit based on NIST framework versus ISO framework. And there's a lot of different differences between the two. Selecting which one's the right one is going to be a personal decision. But if you were to boil that down at a high level, you might say that if you're dealing in the US with US companies and US standards, NIST is pretty much the de facto framework or organization with a set of frameworks. If you're going to do a lot of overseas international business, ISO tends to be the thing, because if your international community doesn't really recognize NIST because it's a US-based standard, they're going to want to see ISO. So it might be as simple as that, and asking your organization, what is our client base? Who are we trying to support with this? If you're working with a cyber provider, they may say, we don't care which one you go to. Maybe you want to look at which one is the cheapest and easiest to accomplish, so that you can make the most gains for the cheapest amount of dollars that you're having to monetize for this, as well as the amount of work that you go into. And then maybe over time you mature to some of the more difficult frameworks. This will be the same if you go into healthcare. They're going to have their own. The insurance field tends to have their own. Banking have their own. So again, talk with your organization about what are the reasons you're doing it, and then what are your needs, and then determine if you have a requirement versus a nice to have. Once you do that, you're going to want to establish the requirements. Again, this kind of ties into number 1, but really, what are you required to do? There are certain things that are looked for in different frameworks. So as an example, a SOC audit, although people say pass and fail, does not actually offer a pass or fail. It'll offer things like, do you have major deficiencies? Do you have any major issues that need to be corrected? But it's not a, here's a score and a line in the sand, pass fail. So if something like a pass fail is a requirement, you're going to want to look at another audit. So just understanding what your internal requirements are and why you're doing it, again, who you're trying to please, is going to be important. A lot of times too, depending on your role in the organization, you're being tasked with this, but you don't necessarily have the information, and the person tasking you doesn't have the information. So determining the right people who need to give you this, and the right group of stakeholders, is going to be critical. The last thing you're going to want to do is go through all these steps, hire an audit firm, start collecting your documentation, potentially go through the audit, only to find out there were stakeholders that weren't engaged and there were things that were missing, and you're just going to have to go back and spend money to do it over. The next thing is going to be determining costs. This, I think, is one of the most challenging aspects because, one, if you've never done this before, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what to ask necessarily. But two, folks like to get on the phone with auditors and just say, I need this audit. How much is it going to cost? That's too broad and vague a question to ask an auditor because it's going to be dependent on a lot of things like the framework. How quickly do you want to do it? How much input do you want from them? How much are you doing yourself versus you have to outsource? How far along are you with your own documentation, tool implementations, et cetera? There may be a set fee for the actual audit itself, and they may say, we'll audit you over a 5-day period, this many hours at this dollars per hour. But that's only one component. You may have to author documentation, you may have to procure tools, you may need a pre-audit. There's a lot of additional steps. So determining costs is going to be, again, lengthy. And if you haven't come up with your requirements, you're likely to get the cost for the things that you're asking for, but you're likely to miss a lot of costs that you weren't thinking about. And again, if you're the person turning this into executive leadership and you say, well, this is going to cost us $30,000 and take 2 weeks, they sign off on it, it ends up taking up, months to get everything prepped, plus that 2 weeks, plus things that were missed, and it costs you $100,000, you're going to be grossly inaccurate. Once you get those things, though, then it's really about choosing the right audit firm. I think there's really 2 ways you can go with this. If you're okay with their cost, if you've got a good feel, if they feel comfortable, they feel like they're going to be a good partner, and that part is difficult because from a sales perspective, what you get from a salesperson and what you get from the actual auditors could be vastly different. You get an opportunity to speak to the auditors, see how easy they are to work with, see how responsive they are. That's a very good sign too, is if you're essentially scoping out and auditioning for auditors and you're having poor response times and difficulties in communication just getting through the sales process, that's when they're in theory most likely to be responsive. What do you think is going to happen once they're actually on board and they're juggling you with all of the other client base? You can ask things like, what is your backlog? How long does it take? An audit might only take 2 weeks, but they may spread it out over 3 months because of the number of bodies they have against the amount of work they have. You're going to want to know that in advance, especially if you have a timeline that says I have to be certified by X date. The other thing you're going to want to do is potentially ask some questions like, hey, I've gone through some audits before. There were some controls I had to meet. The auditors were very stern. They were not flexible. Here's a scenario, and I think the auditor should have worked with me, and see how they feel, see how they respond. If they come back and it's black and white, this is what the control states, and this is what you have to do, you can probably make an assumption that they're going to be less flexible when you actually get into the audit. And understand that no matter how well you're prepared, there's always going to be controls where the framework was written, but technology has changed faster than the changes are being made to the frameworks. A good example would be, when everybody was on-prem, things like wireless access points, knowing all the assets on your network were extremely important. When you move to the cloud and it's in a vendor's data center, the scenario is not the same. You're not going to be introducing a wireless access point, but that's still a control and they're still going to expect you to meet it. And you're going to have to work with an auditor who says, I know this doesn't make sense for your environment. So either we want to get this out of scope, not applicable, or here's how we want to work through that. If you see them working with you and being helpful, that's one of the indications they might be the right audit firm for you. Obviously, go check references, see if you can find reviews online, because if they give you references, they may have handpicked, obviously, the ones they had a good experience with, see how long they've been in business, see how many people they have, and also see who are the people you're going to get. They typically will have different auditors for different aspects. So a database auditor would be different than a Windows operating system auditor, and they might come at a different price point. So look at the type of skill sets you're getting, look at the skill sets and see if the dollar amounts make sense. I've worked with auditors in the past where everyone was at a very high bill rate because everybody was a senior auditor. I had no issue with the senior auditor being at a certain bill rate, but I questioned why I needed 6 senior auditors. Why couldn't I have 1 or 2 and then some junior to intermediate people? And when you start to go ask them, how do you define junior, intermediate, and senior? An intermediate might have up, 5 to 10 years experience. I don't need a senior with 15 to 20 years. 5 to 10 is sufficient. So you need to think about those types of things and ask those types of questions. And then also consider how much of this needs to be outsourced. Within your own organization, yes, you're hiring an auditor, but do you know how to do the work so that you can pass the audit? You likely may have to outsource authoring of policy and procedures and SOPs. You may have to outsource the deployment of tools and the configurations, the evidence gathering, et cetera. So look at those as a cost and a additional time grab for you, because if you don't have someone already contracted to do that, and then you have to go search for that organization, now you're looking for two organizations to do two different sets of tasks with two different costs. And then last but not least, it probably sounds like a no-brainer, get leadership buy-in. But the reason it's last is because you're going to have leadership buy-in at the beginning. If they're asking you to go out and get an audit and find an auditor, they have a reason why they want this. You have their buy-in, but you have their buy-in because they're saying this is what I want. Once they see all of the questions you bring to them, the business decisions they have to make, the costs that are involved, the timeline, you're going to want to go back and get that buy-in again, because they, depending on if they have to have this as a requirement or it's a nice thing to have from a business marketing perspective, their feelings about getting this audit may have changed over time. And you don't want to assume that everybody is on board with the scenario that's about to play out. So definitely get that buy-in a second time if you got it the first time. Preparation. This one is probably the thing that causes the most headaches for folks, because if done incorrectly or lackadaisically, this is where you're going to get huge delays, huge numbers of resource hours that have to be put in, and a lot of costs that really shouldn't have been hidden or missed will appear to be hidden or missed cost. And it's really just due to a lack of preparation. So first and foremost, you want to build a schedule. And these 5 items, for the most part, really are in an order you want to follow. You could probably throw some more items in there specific to, like I said, your niche, industry that you're in or the framework that you're going after. But these 5 at a minimum, build the schedule. The schedule needs to be as comprehensive as it can be, with all of the resources, all of the dependencies, timelines, account for PTO and holidays and mistakes and things of that nature. Knowing due dates for everything is extremely important. Your auditor should be able to tell you, at week 5 of 12, we'll want this. You don't necessarily know when week 5 is yet because you haven't scheduled it, but you know that it's going to be in that 5th week, and you can start building it out. You need to gather evidence. Most auditors are going to ask for a year's worth of evidence. So if you know, for example, that you're not going to be audited for 6 months or 9 months, you can begin gathering all the evidence on a quarterly basis, storing it in a repository, so that when the auditor does ask you to go upload things, you've already got that collected, and you've got it collected for the right timeframes, and it's a simple exercise. One of the most difficult and challenging things to do is if you meet with an auditor, let's say on January 1st, and they say, we're going to start auditing you on March 1st, but we need to see evidence from 6 months, 9 months ago. You may not have it. Grabbing evidence today doesn't count unless you can prove that that was the state it was in 9 months ago. So doing that ahead of time is going to be a huge time saver for you. You're also going to need to identify the appropriate individual resources. And again, this most likely is internal, but if you're dealing with an MSP, MSSP, you're a very small shop that outsources to consultants, you may need to involve those individuals as well as look to hire individuals. If you've never gone through this, you don't know what's expected, and you legitimately don't have the time to take this on as a collateral duty, when you're budgeting in that first phase, I would absolutely budget for a person to come in and do this, even if you're hiring them as a 1099 or temporary worker from like a staff aug company. It's going to be cheaper in the long run to pay someone else who has the time and the experience to do this than you taking it on yourself as a learning experience. You can always shadow that person the first go around, see what they do, see if you have a repository and a process. And then after the first one's done and you pass, if you want to take it on the next year and that point forward, you've got kind of like the plan and the model and the schedule and everything there. You can just kind of rinse and repeat. Maybe you don't need the resource after that first one. You're also going to want to establish pass-fail criteria. This one's important because you need to be asking questions with the auditor as to what do I have to do from a pass-fail score perspective, as well as what happens if you're identifying things within my audit. If you find something like you're missing some documentation or you're missing a paragraph or a statement in a policy, most auditors are going to be nice enough to say, hey, there's a week or 2 week period where as I'm reviewing, I'm going to come back and say you're missing things. And all you have to do is write a couple sentences. They will usually let you write those sentences, reevaluate that control, and move on. However, if you have to deploy a product, if they say you don't have the evidence for a long enough period of time, you don't have a way around that in the middle of that 2 week period. And you need to know whether or not it's going to affect you greatly enough to fail the audit, whether or not you're going to have to pass with corrective action plans and fix it later, whether you're going to pay for a second audit. That's fairly common as well as paying for a second smaller audit where they come back and reassess the failures. There's nothing wrong with that. You can get through that initial audit. You can find your find your failures, fix them, and bring them back. But understand that you may not have a certification during that period. You may have to wait for them to get you back on their schedule based on their backlog. And let's say there's a 3 month gap between the first audit, second audit, and then another month or two for them to prepare the certification reports. If that 5 or 6 month period causes you to miss a deadline from a contractual perspective, that's an issue, and you need to plan for that in advance. And then the step that I think is the most grossly performed and most grossly inaccurate is the pre-assessment. Most organizations that I've worked with over the last 20 years are willing to do an internal pre-assessment. Some are even willing to pay an outside organization like an MSP or a third-party consultant to do a pre-assessment. But almost everyone that I've ever seen, when they do it themselves, they give themselves credit for controls that they really will not pass with an auditor, or when the outside organization comes in and does the pre-assessment, they fight and argue it. It's understandable to some extent why you might think it's good to fight and argue these controls because you believe you're doing something. But if that third party is telling you, look, I'm looking at these controls the same way the auditor would, and the auditor is likely to say the exact same things I am, and you fight internally to get that third party to pass you on those controls, you've passed a pre-assessment that doesn't count. Then you get to your audit and all of a sudden you think you're in good shape and you start failing controls. It's much better to go harder on yourself and have that pre-assessment by a third party to be just, scrutinize every little aspect of your organization, find anything that the auditor could fail you on or give you partial credit on, and then from there start working on the ones that are worth the most points or have an automatic pass fail, and get to the point where you're confident that even if a couple of these things come back as still failing or partial, you've still earned enough points to pass. So as an example, if 80 is a passing range or a passing score, you don't want to march to an 80, getting an 81 or 82 in a pre-assessment and then going out and being assessed. You really want to be in the 90s so that if the auditor comes back and gives you an 83 when you thought you should have a 93, either way you pass. I see that happen over and over, and organizations don't understand why everything went so well during the pre-audit or the pre-assessment and then why they failed when the auditor was actually paid to be there. This is really no different than when you study for an exam and you tell yourself you're more prepared than you really are. And again, most organizations, if you don't have an internal resource who truly understands how to interpret controls, when you read the control, you are more likely to oversimplify that control, whereas the auditor is going to have not only that control, but they're going to have a supplemental component that says, look for these 7 things. You're looking at for 1 or 2, they're looking for 7. Maybe you both agree on the 1 or 2 that you feel you did, but there's those 4 or 5 that you weren't aware of, and then they fail you. So again, I know I'm harping on that one, but there's really no point doing all this work only to give yourself a false sense of security and hope. The audit process itself is actually going to be pretty simple, and how well or poorly it goes is really going to be based on that preparation slide that we just talked about. The main things you want to look for here, because this one's kind of like once the train gets going, there's a schedule, there are specific things you have to do in specific timelines. You really can't alter those other than to delay them, is you want to avoid single points of failure. If there's one person who's going to be providing evidence or there's one person who's going to be doing interviews, you really want to avoid that single point of failure in case they get sick, they quit, you fire them, whatever the case may be. One of the worst things that you can do is have someone scheduled, they can't be there for whatever reason. You bring someone else in who has no idea what they're being asked. You stick them in front of an auditor, and the auditor says, "Is this how you operate all year long?" And one of the things that most folks maybe don't understand about audits in general is that the majority of audits, whether they say it or not, are designed to elicit a behavioral cultural change within the organization. They want to see that security is baked into the organization and everything that you do. It's not an afterthought. And culturally, everyone is doing what they can to elevate your security posture and lower your risk. If you can't navigate to the things that show what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, the auditor is likely going to look at you as you're not doing these on a day-to-day basis. You're only doing them when the auditor comes in and asks for that evidence. And that inability to quickly answer questions, identify evidence, show them through over the shoulder screen sharing or whatever the case may be, will be an indication to the auditor you have not baked this into your culture. And I can tell you one of the things that comes out of all of the boxes on this slide is that if an auditor feels like you've lied to them or you're not doing something, it's like a thread and they're going to pull on that thread. You want everything to be as quick and easy and painless for the auditor. And like I said, you've adopted it as a culture so that they don't stop and nitpick. So you're going to meet regularly and often, make sure your assignments and deadlines are met. Escalate quickly if you discover an issue, that's internally or with the auditor. Again, avoid lying or deceiving the auditor just to try to get points, because again, maybe you argue with them and get points for one control. It says something to them like something's not right. They start nitpicking other controls, and now you lose points in places they would have never normally looked. You want to rehearse these interviews in advance and bring your best resources. Your best engineer or your best system admin may not be the best person to put into an interview with an auditor. If they get nervous, if they've never done this, that is not the place to put them. You want someone who's calm and collected. When the auditor says, "I'd like to see how you're doing something in Active Directory," and they say, "No problem," and they log right in, they get to it, they show them, they can answer all their questions. So don't just necessarily go for who's the smartest or best at their job. Consider these intricacies that come along with auditing. You can argue and debate findings to some extent. Just be prepared to do that politely. Like the example I gave, if you don't have an on-premises infrastructure and someone's asking you to identify assets on it, you can make the argument that you don't understand why that's in scope, why it should be not applicable, give your rationale. They may or may not agree with you, but again, do it politely. And then ask questions when you don't understand or you're confused. The auditors are the experts for a reason. They don't expect you to be experts. Don't assume that you know something or you can just get by, versus feeling like you might look stupid by asking that question, because this isn't a homework assignment in school. This is a lot of money and a certification on the line. Most of them will be very happy to explain things to you and even help you. I mean, their goal too is for you to pass. If they have to fail you, you're likely to not do business with them. So everyone's kind of goal here is to pass, but they have to be ethical when they do it. And then last but not least, the post-audit steps. Document your deficiencies. The auditor will normally do that, but you want to document them also from an internal perspective. Were you having a difficulty getting evidence? Were you not having the right people, et cetera? So all the kind of internal stuff that you want to correct. And then probably most important, remediate those deficiencies. Again, you're going to remediate, in most cases, the ones the auditor finds, because that might have a pass-fail indication or something going along with it. But it's the ones internally. You don't want to go to the next audit and make the same mistakes, so you want to remediate them. You want to go ahead and plan for and schedule your next surveillance, 1/3 full audit, whatever that auditor is calling it for that framework, because the minute this audit completes, you're essentially in evidence collection mode for the next audit. You're in policy update mode for the next audit. So you might as well just schedule all of that out so that as soon as you're done, you can let all of the folks who supported you this time know what they're on the hook for and when for the next one. Hold the lessons learned meeting, what went well, what didn't, and come out of that by refining processes and procedures. One of the things that I've seen time and time again is organizations are very good about holding a lessons learned. They'll come up with a list of things that did not go well. That document gets shelved, and a year later, they make the exact same mistakes. You have 1, 2, or 3 years, depending on what type of audit you're going after, to make these corrections. So you really should take those items and work on correcting them versus just making it, a paperweight. And then evaluate the auditors against their schedule, budget, their personalities, competency. Just because you agreed to have this auditor today doesn't mean you necessarily want to have them for your next audit. If they couldn't get you things on time, if they went over budget, if they were difficult to work with, if you asked them questions about the intent of controls and you didn't feel like they really understood and could give you the information that you need, then maybe they're not the right audit firm for you. Maybe they gave you a lot of junior to intermediate folks, and in this case, you really did need the senior folks. Make all of those determinations and then figure that out quickly so that you can start shopping for a new auditor, as your budget might change as well as your schedule for the following year. And on that note, I will stop there and open up to any questions. If there are any, please feel free to throw them in the Q&A section. And I'll wait for a minute. If not, I appreciate you guys joining us as always. And I will see you next month.